Now we are discussing about the process management, very important topic in operating system. So what is a process? We'll be discussing it in length, but the process can be thought right now as a program under execution. The program you write, there are programs like the system programs also, and those programs, when they are under execution, they are known as the process. So when a process runs, that is the program under execution, it would require CPU time, memory, files, input output devices in order to complete its task. And these resources can be allocated while it is created, while it is executing. So the way we have kilogram, the height in centimeter or meter, the process is the unit of work in most of the system, unit of work. And the system consists of various processes. We have operating system processes and user process. The two type of mainly processes are there, and these operating system processes are executed. They execute system codes. We would call them later as system processes, and the user processes, they execute the user code, and they may execute concurrently also. So it can be single thread, it can have multiple thread. A process can have multiple thread, that means it is a kind of sub process. What is this thread? Thread is nothing but the lightweight process. So it has its own resources, but they share some sort of resources with the parent process also. So operating system is responsible for various activities in connection with the process and thread. First, the creation and deletion of the user as well as the system process, and how to schedule these processes, and how to synchronize them, communication between them, and the deadlock handling as well. So process, we are going to discuss about the notion of process, that is the program under execution, and this is the basis of all computation we are talking about. In here also operating system, in the computer organization also. So in order to describe different processes, we'll discuss about the scheduling, the creation and termination, the communication, etc. And we'll also see what it means when we talk about a client-server system. So process, as we just said, it is a program under execution. So operating system, they execute variety of programs. And the way could be, it can be given in batch or like job, batch systems, or the user program or task like time shared systems. That is, a time is allocated to each of the process, and one will execute, then other will, like this. And most of the books, they interchangeably use this job and process. So process, as we just said, the program is a passive entity, while a process is an active entity. It has its own program counter, process stack to keep the temporary data, and the data section for the global variables. So we have a text section where the program code is actually there, and if you have or if you want to run many copies of a program, each is a separate process. The text section will be equivalent, but the data section, this text section will be same, but the data section will vary. So process, as you said, program under execution, it executes in sequential fashion. You will see in the diagram also. So the process essentially include the program counter, which is called as PC, and a stack and a data section. So a process in memory is something like this. This is the text. This is where the data is kept. Here we have heap. So all those where all those data or all those dynamic memory allocation is done in heap. Then we have stack also. Now process can have various states, means just like you and me, we are sleeping, we are dancing, we are eating. So a process can also have various states, like the news process, which is just being created. Running means instructions are being executed. It is waiting for certain event to happen or some input output to complete. Then we have ready. That is, process is waiting now for the processes to take control. That is, to be assigned to a processor. And then we have terminated. That is, after the process has finished the execution. So process is running one process at a time. So these are the states. New process is admitted to the ready queue. Now this ready queue we'll see about various schedulers. So from ready queue, the process will go to the running state, and if it has this is done by scheduler dispatch. This is what dispatch is all about. Then input output or event wait. If some wait or input output is there, then the process goes to the waiting state. And after this input output or event is completed, it again waits or join the ready queue, from where the scheduler will eventually take it. And once the task is done, it is terminated. So this is the PCB, that is the accounting of a process. What is the process state? What is the process number? What is the program counter? Program counter is the next instruction which has to be executed. Register it is using, the memory limits, the list of open files it is using. So apart from this, what we saw, we have process state as we saw in the diagram. We have program counters, the CPU registers, etc. Right? So I want to give you a glimpse that this is a process P0. Now it is executing. Now some interrupt has come. When interrupt or system call has come, this PCB state is saved. Its state is saved, and then when this P1 wants to execute, then the state of PCB1, that is the process control block 1, is reloaded. Then it is executed. Then when some other process has to work, this is saved in the PCB1. Now it is being reloaded, that is P0 won't start from here. Now PCB0 load, it is being loaded or reloaded. So we have various CPU scheduling information. We'll talk about this. What is priority? What are the pointers? Memory management information is also there. PCB accounting information, that is amount of time CPU it is being used, or CPU time it has consumed. Then the input output status information. This will include the list of input output devices being allocated. Then threads, as we just saw, that the lightweight processes are threads. And when we come to process scheduling, because we want to maximize CPU utilization, we always want that CPU should always be doing some task. So the objective of multi-programming is just this. So the CPU, it switches so frequently from one process to another that all programs are running at a time. We'll see, the system or the user will see that, okay, everything is running. So in order to achieve this maximum CPU utilization, the process scheduler, it selects the available process from the ready queue for the CPU to work upon. If you have a single processor system, then there will be one process running. If you have more than one process, then the CPU has to wait until it transfers the control to other, or you can say the process has to wait for the CPU to be executed, or to get itself executed on the CPU. There are various queues, by the way. What are the queues? When the process enters the system, it is kept in the job queue. Now, the process is in now memory, waiting to execute. This is ready queue. This is job queue, this is ready queue. And this ready queue, this header contains all the pointers to the first and last PCBs in the list. It will have the first and last PCB in the list, and each of which has a pointer to the next PCB, that is the process control block. Then we also have a list of process waiting for the input output device. These are in device queue. So now, after a process in this ready queue is selected for execution, various things can happen. It can issue an IO request. It will be placed in IO queue, input output queue. Now it could create sub-processes, then it will wait for its termination. And it could be interrupted, so it will go to the ready queue. And you see, there are various queues. So process actually migrate between all these queues. Just an example, that this is the ready queue, and this is the head and tail. As I just said, it has the pointer. So this is PCB7. PCB7 has a pointer to PCB2. And again here, these are various ready queue terminal queue, disk unit, map, this tape drive you can say. So various queue header is there for head and tail, and if it has nothing, no worry. If it has head and tail, then these are being executed, right? Queuing diagram, this represent the process scheduling. What happens? The ready queue is the place where the process is kept in order to CPU to take over. Now one is selected and sent to CPU. Now what can happen? The things which can happen is the process may have some input output requests, so it will be kept in input output queue. And once this input output is done, it is again being sent to the ready queue. If time slice is expired, again sent to the ready queue. If it forks a child, then it will wait for child to execute, then to ready queue. Then it will wait for an interrupt, so interrupt may occur, then again sent to the ready queue. Then we have various schedulers. As I just said, the scheduling is very important. As we said, that process actually migrate between various queues throughout its lifetime. So we need to have appropriate scheduler to select the process, to go into the queue. So if you have a batch system, that means you are giving all the processes at once, then these processes are simply spooled to say a mass storage device that is typically a disk, and one by one they are being executed. Then we have long-term scheduler and short-term scheduler. The main difference between these two is the frequency of execution. Long-term is executed or it works lesser than the short-term scheduler. So this long-term scheduler is also known as job scheduler. This short-term scheduler is also known as CPU scheduler. So what this long-term scheduler does, it will select a process from the pool, and now it will load it to the memory, not to the CPU. See, select from the pool and load into the memory. Now, this CPU scheduler does what? It selects a process from the ready queue, which is ready to execute, and now it allocates it to the CPU. As far as the degree of multiprogramming is controlled by long-term scheduler, because it is selecting the process from the spool. Then we have input-output bound process and CPU-bound process. Now, input-output bound process, it is going to spend most of the time in input-output computation. So it has very short CPU burst. Wherein this CPU-bound process, it does a lot of computation. So it has very long CPU burst also. Then the long-term scheduler, it has to select a good mix of these two in order to have to give a good performance. Then we have sometimes mid-term scheduler also. So mid-term scheduler does what? It does the swapping. So it removes the process from the memory and thereby reducing the multiprogramming. So later it can reintroduce that process as required. And this swapping is very important because memory is limited. The main memory is limited and it needs to be freed up to make place for the other processes. Then we have one more thing which is called as context switch. What is this context switch? See, when we have a process, say P1. Now, when this P2 has to be executed or if this has to be swapped, switching to P2, there is a switching from P1 to P2. This state has to be stored and this state of P2 has to be reintroduced. So at this time, the CPU is not doing any good work. This is completely overhead. So the context switch is a overhead because CPU is not doing anything here, right? So this is called context switch, where switching from one, and if we say context switch is going on more, that is the switching from one process to another process is going on more, then it will be a problem because we want the switching has to be very fast so that the CPU actually works on the process. Then there are various operation on processes also. That is the process creation. In process creation, first of all, the parent process can create multiple processes, or you can say the child processes. So these new processes, they are created by whom? They are created by the parent. And these child processes, they may get resource directly from OS, or they may constrained also, so that it may be possible that the child process may want more resources, so it may be prevented from that. So when these child processes are created, what it does, it gets some sort of initialization data from the parent process. And when the process is creating a new one, there are certain possibilities of execution also. The child and the parent, they can go along, that is, they may execute concurrently. Or otherwise, there may be one more aspect. The parent will wait that these children should work it out and it gets terminated. So we have this address space possibilities also in this case. When we create a new process, the child process may get a duplicate of the parent, or the child process may have a program itself loaded into it. We'll see a unique example that this is fork. Fork is the system call which creates a new process, and exec, this is a system call. This is used after a fork just in order to replace the processor memory space with a new program. So this is the fork. The child is there, then exec. When it exits, then it has to wait. This parent waits, and when it exits, then it resumes. We'll see the implementation also. This is in Unix, so we have this process. It is being forked. If some error is there, it is being said. Otherwise, we execute this execp, and then the process, the parent process is waiting, and then child is completed, it is executed. This will exit. Then we have Windows example also. Windows example like this. We have process information. We create process. We first initialize them, then create process. Some manage.paint.exe is being taken as a process. And then after that, once the child is done, that is, wait is over, the child completes. Then we can close the header. We have Java example also. This is Java example. Here the process builder class will create a process. Again, the same stuff is going on. The child will be made and it will complete, and then we can close it. Then we have process termination. What is this process termination? This process, once it is being created, and after the final statement, it closes, that is, it terminates. So at this point, the process may return the data to its parent process, and all the process resources, they are to be given back to the OS, right? And the parent process also can terminate the child. That is why the parent would want the children to terminate. First of all, the child is exceeding the usage of some resources, and we don't want that. Even the task assigned to the child, it may not be required by the parent. And if the parent is exiting, the OS may not want the child to execute. So there is a cascading termination. Then IPC, inter-process communication. This is very important. When there can be two types of process: independent process and cooperating process. So independent means they are independent. So process, they don't share data with one another. While in cooperating process, the data is being shared by the cooperating process. So why would we want the cooperation? First of all, we want information sharing. We want to increase the computation. There has to be some modularity, that is, separate process will do separate function, and of course the convenience, because the individual user may want to work on various tasks at the same time. So there are two fundamental modes of IPC, that is shared memory and message passing. This is the message passing. This process A will pass the message to the kernel, and from here the process B will get the information from the kernel. How about the shared memory? There is a small shared memory. The process A will give the data to the shared area, and the process B will take the data from this shared area. So what are these shared memory system? When we have a shared memory, we have a common buffer pool. This is called a buffer pool. And has to be some code for implementing this buffer. And, this must be explicitly written by the application program. So we'll see about the producer-consumer problem also, because when we are dealing with cooperating process, the producer, it produces certain information which is consumed by the consumer process. So we have this unbounded buffer and bounded buffer. Unbounded buffer, there is no limit of the size. Bounded buffer, because there is fixation in the size. When we have message passing system, what is the message passing or message system when the communication is going on. The message can be sent by, there can be a process, or process can send the message. The size can be fixed, the size can be variable. So the fixed size, the state, it has very straightforward system implementation, and the programming task is quite difficult. While when it comes to variable size, it has quite complex system implementation, but the programming task is quite simple. And there has to be a communication link between the process in order to communicate. So there are methods for logically implementing these links. You can have a direct communication, you can have a asymmetric communication, we'll talk about this just now, and automatic and explicit buffering. See, the message passing facility, it should provide two operations, first to send and then to receive. This send can have a fixed or a variable size. So if this P and Q, they want to communicate, they need to have a communication link between them, and they should send the data, or they can exchange the data using this send and receive. So this implementation can be physical also, and it can be some logical way also. So this is the direct communication, this is the indirect communication. Here, each process must explicitly name the recipient or the sender. But here, the message are sent to mailbox or to the ports. So what are the properties of communication link here in case of direct, and what is the properties of communication link in case of indirect communication? Here the link is established automatically between every pair of process that want to communicate. So the process needs to know the identity. While here the link is established between a pair of process only if both members, they share a mailbox. They share a mailbox there only. Here the link is associated with exactly two processes, and here it can be more than two processes because you have a mailbox already. And here exactly one link exists between each pair. Here a number of multiple links can be between two communicating processes. Then we have symmetric addressing. In this, both sender and receiver, they must name the other to communicate. And while in the asymmetric addressing, what happens? Only the sender needs the name of the recipient. Only sender needs the name of the recipient. The recipient it would not require the name of the sender. While the mailbox can be of two type, it can be owned by the process itself, or it can be owned by the operating system. So if the mailbox is owned by the process, the owner can only receive and user can only send. So the mailbox will disappear once the owner process terminates. But in the case of OS, the mailbox which is owned by OS, the OS must provide a mechanism just to allow process to create a mailbox, send and receive via this mailbox, and just delete a mailbox. Then we have synchronization, very important aspect, synchronization. So the message passing here can be either blocking or not blocking. What is blocking? What is non-blocking? This blocking is considered as synchronous. This non-blocking is considered as asynchronous. So here in blocking, blocking send and blocking receive. This blocking send has sender block until the message is received. While in blocking receive, this has a receiver blocked until the message is available. While in the asynchronous mode, that is non-blocking send, in this sender send the message and continue. No worry about that. And non-blocking receive, it has a receiver receive a valid message, or it may be none. So let us see the difference in more detail. See, the synchronous message passing, or you can say blocking or non-blocking. In blocking send, the sending message is blocked until the message is received by the receiving process or by the mailbox. While in blocking receive, the receiver blocks until a message is available. In the asynchronous, we can have non-blocking send and non-blocking receive. In this non-blocking send, the sending process sends the message and resumes the operation. It will not wait. While in non-blocking receive, the receiver may get some valid message or it may get some invalid message also. So we have one more combinations also, various combinations apart from this, and we have rendezvous also. When this both sender and receiver, they are blocked. Then we have buffering. So when we are transferring the message is exchanged by a process which resides in a temporary queue. This is temporary queue. So a queue can be implemented in three ways here. this can be implemented as a zero capacity, bounded capacity, or unbounded capacity. So you can have a maximum length of 0. So the link can't have any message waiting for it or in it. And the sender must block until the recipient receives the message. This is the zero capacity. But in terms of bounded capacity, the queue may have infinite length. You can have n message, maximum n message you can decide. So if the queue is not full when the message is sent, it is just placed in this queue. This is placed in the queue. And if this link is full, the sender must block until there is some space available in the queue. When it comes to unbounded capacity, infinite length, potentially depending upon the system. So any number of messages can wait in it and the sender would never block. So we have examples of this IPC, POSIX, MAC, WinXP. And the main thing which is going on between client and server is first it has to ask for a connection. There is a request. Then there is a connection port. The server handles it. And we have the client communication port. Again, the handling is done. The client communication port here and server communication port here. There is specific name, number. I'll just tell you. So communication in client-server systems, there can be mainly three aspects. It can be through sockets, RPCs, or RMI. This is RMI, that is remote method invocation. So the socket, this is the endpoint of communication. When two processes, they communicate over a network, they employ a pair of sockets, one for each process. When this socket is identified an IP number, this is the IP number, and this is the port number. This is the IP number, this is the port number. So sockets are basically for client-server architecture. Here, the server would wait. In its port, it will wait through listening that what is incoming. So once the request is received, the server would accept the request from the client socket just in order to complete the connection, right? So server may implement specific services like the telnet, the FTP, HTTP, because we have well-known ports for it. So the connection, as we just said, it has to be very unique when we are trying to communicate through sockets. When the communication using sockets, because it is port-based, it is considered to be low level. So the RPCs and RMI, they are some sort of high-level methods of communication. So when we are talking in terms of sockets, we have a socket here at host X. We may have a web server, say Apache, etc., IIS, and this is the IP of this system, IP of this system. This is the port where it is sending. This is the port where it is listening. Then we have RPCs, remote procedure call. Here, the message is exchanged for RPC communication. They're quite well structured. So they are addressed to a RPC daemon, which is actually listening to a port on the remote system. And it also contains an identifier of the function just in order to execute. And now we have to, for function, we need to pass the parameter to the function. So the function is then executed and the output is sent back to the requester in a separate message. And the port is again a number, as we just saw, is included at the start of message packet. So the system can have various ports within just one network address. Say if a remote process needs a service, it addresses its message to the proper port. And here RPC system, they provide a stub also. The stub is nothing but a client side proxy for actual procedure on the client side, this stub. And this is to hide the details of how this communication is going on. So when the client invoke a remote procedure, that is the RPC system calls, this RPC system, it calls the appropriate stub just to pass the parameter. So now this stub locates the port on the server. And also we have something called marshals. These marshals, they are packing the parameters in a form which is suitable to that network. So the stub then transmits a message to the server using a message passing. Then we have a similar stub on the server side also, which will receive the message and now invoke the procedure on the server. And if necessary, the return values, they are passed back to the client. There are various RPC systems. They are machine independent, because the data can be Little Indian, they can be, because Motorola, Intel, they have different, formations. So big Indian, Little Indian can be there. So we have something called as external data representation. This is one of the representations. So on the client side and server side, what will happen? On the client side, the parameter marshalling, this involves converting the machine dependent data into XDR before going or sending it to the server. And what happens on the server side? This XDR data is unmarshaled here, and they are converted into the machine-dependent representation of the server. There are two approaches for binding the client and server. The binding information, they may predetermined, pre-known in the form of fixed port addresses, or binding can be done also dynamically. We have a rendezvous mechanism. We also call it as a matchmaker daemon. So this is how it is going on. We have a client. So the user calls kernel to send the RPC message to the procedure X. Now what kernel does? Kernel sends message to the matchmaker in order to find the port number. So this is the message which is going. So now matchmaker receives message and look up the answer. That is, it has to search for the port. So the matchmaker replies to the client with certain port P. So this port is going. The kernel now knows which port. So kernel places the port P in the user RPC message. Now the kernel sends the RPC. Here the daemon which is listening to the port P, now it receives the message. Now daemon processes the request and sends the output, and now kernel is happy. Kernel receives the message and passes it to the user. So this is all this is the timeline diagram of what I just explained to you. Then we have pipes also. Something like this pipe, water pipe. So the pipe acts as a conduit between two processes to communicate. So in implementing a pipe, we have certain issues. Does this pipe allow unidirectional or multiple communication, means unidirectional or half duplex, two-way communication, full duplex? There is a relationship between communicating process or not, like the parent-child? Or can pipes communicate over network also, or they are talking in the same machine? So we can have ordinary pipes for that. This only allows communication between a parent and a child. So this uses the concept of producer-consumer. We'll talk about this. So this producer writes to right end of the pipe, and the consumer reads from the read end of the pipe, right? And ordinary pipes, they just are not now available because they cease to exist as soon as this process termination is the process communication is terminated. This is how this ordinary pipes are simply unidirectional. And in Windows they are named anonymous pipes. Then we have, apart from anonymous, we have named pipes also. They are quite powerful than we just saw the ordinary pipes. So they permit the unrelated process also to communicate with one another. Like the parent-child, they are related, but there are others also. So this is bidirectional. So it is not required that always parent-child relationship should be there. So this is a brief idea about this chapter. I hope I have given you some glimpse so that when you study your book, it will be all clear to you. Thank you so much. Take care of yourself.